On the night of March 13th through 14th, Veronica never expected to die. One moment, she was reaching for a glass of water. Then, darkness swallowed her whole. But death wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. She watched her lifeless body from above, felt herself pulled into an abyss where tormented whispers surrounded her. Just as fear consumed her, a blinding light shattered the void. Jesus stood before her, and what he revealed next about the future and the mark would change everything. For most of her life, Veronica had lived a life of quiet devotion, far removed from the chaos of the world. She had given herself fully to God, taking her vows as a nun at a young age. Her days were spent in prayer, service, and solitude, seeking only to grow closer to Christ. The world outside her convent moved at a frantic pace, but Veronica was content in her calling to help the poor, care for the sick, and intercede for those who had lost their way. She had never questioned her purpose, trusting that God would guide her steps. Her life was not one of grandeur or recognition, but she found peace and simplicity. The worries of the world, money, ambition, power, meant nothing to her. Her only concern was faith. But what happened to her changed everything. If someone had told her that one day she would die and return with a message of urgency, she would have dismissed it. She had read accounts of near-death experiences, but they always seemed distant, like stories meant for others, not for her. And yet, that cold morning, she faced the unimaginable. It began with a weakness she couldn't explain. For days, she had felt tired, her limbs heavy, her breath short. She ignored it, assuming it was exhaustion from fasting and long hours of prayer. She had lived a disciplined life, often pushing her body beyond its limits in devotion to God. She believed he would sustain her, as he always had. That morning, she awoke before dawn, as she had done every day for years. The rain tapped softly against her small window, the air inside her room damp and cold. She reached for her Bible, but her hands trembled, an odd numbness spreading through her fingers. She shook it off and stood, but her legs felt unsteady beneath her. Something was wrong. She told herself she just needed water, a moment to gather her strength. But as she reached for the glass on her bedside table, her vision blurred, the room tilted, and her chest tightened as if a great weight pressed down upon her. Her breath came in short gasps. The glass slipped from her grasp, shattering against the floor. Then, the world around her began to fade. She tried to steady herself, gripping the edge of the wooden table, but her legs gave out beneath her. The last thing she remembered was the cold floor meeting her body, the distant sound of footsteps rushing toward her door, and a voice muffled, urgent, calling her name. Then, nothing. Darkness. At that moment, her life as she knew it ended, but her journey was only beginning. The silence that followed was unlike anything she had ever known. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an absence of everything, no pain, no breath, no weight, just stillness. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, trapped in that strange place between sleep and waking. But as her senses returned, she realized the truth. She was no longer in her body. She could see herself lying on the cold stone floor of her room, her robes pulled around her, her skin pale, her lips slightly parted as if she had tried to speak before she fell. Her chest did not rise or fall. She was utterly still. Then she heard it, the frantic voice of her neighbor, Elena. "Oh, dear Lord, please, someone help," she cried, her voice thick with panic. She stood in the doorway, her face pale with fear, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. Veronica should have felt something: panic, urgency, desperation to call out and tell Elena she was still here. But she didn't. Instead, a strange detachment settled over her. It was as if she were watching a scene from someone else's life. She tried to move, to step forward, but she had no feet, no legs, no hands to reach out with. And yet, she was more aware than she had ever been before. Then, something unseen pulled her. It wasn't a force she could resist. It wasn't hands gripping her, but rather an invisible current tugging at the core of her being, drawing her upward. She rose effortlessly, weightless, as though gravity no longer applied to her. Her small room, the shattered glass on the floor, Elena's frantic cries, everything faded beneath her. She passed through the ceiling as if it weren't there, moving higher and higher into something vast and unfamiliar. Then, the world she had known disappeared completely. Darkness surrounded her, not the darkness of a moonless night, nor the gentle dimness of a candle flickering out. This was deeper, heavier, almost alive. It pressed against her, vast and endless, stretching beyond what her mind could comprehend. At first, there was silence. Then came the whispers. At first, they were distant, soft, almost mournful. But they grew louder, multiplying, overlapping. The voices were filled with sorrow, regret, and something far worse, despair. Some cried out in pain, others pleaded. Some raged in fury. Veronica tried to turn, to see where the voices were coming from, but she had no sense of direction. She was suspended in the void, a soul without a body, a mind without a form. A terrible realization settled in her. Was this hell? Was she being judged? She had spent her life in service to God, in prayer and devotion, and yet she had never been perfect. She had doubted, she had questioned, she had failed. Was that why she was here? Was she being condemned? The thoughts sent a ripple of fear through her, and as if in response, the voices grew more urgent. The darkness around her deepened, thickening like a storm gathering its strength. She wanted to cry out, but she had no mouth. She wanted to run, but she had no feet. Then, from the depths of the void, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shape. It was a presence immense, overwhelming, and suffocating. She could feel it watching her, though she could see nothing. The whispers turned into wails. Terror gripped her. "Dear God, help me." And then she saw it alight. It was faint at first, no larger than a distant star, but it pierced through the darkness with an intensity that made the shadows recoil. The moment she saw it, the voices faltered. The suffocating presence hesitated. The light began to grow, expanding outward, spilling warmth over her like a wave of golden fire. The darkness screamed. She felt something breaking, as though unseen chains had been wrapped around her and were now snapping apart. The light drew closer, and she knew she was not alone. Someone was coming for her, and in that moment, she understood she was being rescued. The light engulfed her, burning away the shadows that had threatened to consume her. Warmth, unlike anything she had ever known, washed over her, filling every part of her being. The sorrowful whispers faded, replaced by a profound stillness. Then she saw him. At first, he was only a figure in the distance, standing at the center of the radiant glow. As he drew closer, she felt something indescribable, an overwhelming presence that was both powerful and tender. His very being exuded love, sorrow, and something else: urgency. Jesus! The moment she saw him, she knew. Every fiber of her existence recognized him not just as a man, not just as a teacher, but as the Alpha and the Omega, the living God. His eyes, deep and piercing, held the weight of eternity, and yet they were filled with compassion as he looked at her. She fell to her knees, not because she chose to, but because she could do nothing else in his presence. All she had ever known paled in comparison. Her past, her prayers, her sacrifices, they all seemed like a mere whisper in the wind before the vastness of his glory. For what felt like an eternity, she could not speak. But she didn't need to. He knew everything. Finally, he extended his hand. His voice was both gentle and unshakable, resonating deep within her. "You must see." At his words, the light around them shifted. The warmth dimmed, and suddenly, she was no longer standing before him. She was somewhere else. A city stretched before her, vast and gleaming, filled with towering buildings, blinking lights, and people moving about in eerie synchronization. Everything was ordered, efficient, and controlled. She looked closer. At first, it seemed peaceful. But then she noticed the subtle details, the way the people walked, their faces devoid of joy, their movements mechanical. It was as if something vital had been stripped from them. Then, she saw the mark, a small insignia, barely noticeable, either on the right hand or the forehead. It was everywhere, on billboards, on digital screens, on the glowing kiosks where people scanned their hands to enter buildings, buy food, or access transportation. No one questioned it. No one resisted. The realization hit her like a wave of ice. This was not just some political system or economic program. This was something far, far deeper. The mark was not forced on people. They took it willingly. They embraced it. And in doing so, they had given up something precious, something eternal. Jesus' voice resonated within her again, sorrowful yet firm. They will be told they have no choice, but I will provide. His words settled over her like a weight. The people in this vision had chosen the mark, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of hunger, fear of rejection, fear of losing their place in the world. The scene changed. Now, she saw the other side, those who had refused the mark. They were not part of the gleaming cities. They were outcasts. She saw a mother standing in a marketplace, her children clinging to her side. She held out a handful of cash to buy bread, but the vendor shook his head, pointing to a scanner. She had no mark. Therefore, she had no right to buy. Tears filled her eyes as she pulled her children away, empty-handed. She saw a man in a hospital, pleading for medicine for his wife. The doctor shook his head. No mark, no treatment. She saw entire families being evicted from their homes, forced into the streets because they refused to comply. And then she saw the hunters, those who had been assigned to find the unmarked and bring them into re-education centers. They weren't soldiers. They were neighbors, friends, even family members. The world had turned against them. Society called them dangerous, extremists, enemies of progress. It was not merely persecution. It was a total rejection of their right to exist. Then, the vision shifted once more. She saw those who had taken the mark. At first, they seemed unchanged. But then, she looked into their eyes. They were empty. At first, it was subtle, a dullness, a lack of light. But as time passed, they became hollow. Their emotions faded. Their love for their families disappeared. She saw a woman who had once held her infant child with tenderness now turn away, as if the baby were nothing. She saw a husband reject his wife who had refused the mark, as though she were a stranger. They had surrendered something far greater than their freedom. They had surrendered their souls. The vision dissolved, and Veronica found herself standing before Jesus once more. Her heart was pounding. Tears burned her eyes. She wanted to beg him to undo it, to stop it from happening, to change what she had seen. But he only looked at her with sorrow. It has already begun. She opened her mouth to protest, but he raised his hand. Tell them. His voice was like thunder, yet filled with love. Warn them. The time is short. She could barely speak. But how will they survive without the mark? His gaze softened. The world will say, they have no choice, but I will provide. At that moment, she understood this was not just a battle of survival. This was a test, a final, eternal choice. The mark was not just a tool of control. It was spiritual submission. The vision began to fade. The light around him grew blinding. She felt herself being pulled back towards something familiar, something painful, something human. She gasped and she awoke. The vision did not end. Even as the scene of the hollow-eyed masses faded, she was drawn into another. This time, the world looked different, darker, colder. The air itself felt heavier, thick with a silent oppression. But this was not the city where the marked lived. This was where the unmarked had gone. She saw them, men, women, children, those who had refused the mark. They were scattered, wandering through desolate streets, huddled together in abandoned buildings, hiding in forests and mountains where they could no longer be found. Their clothes were worn, their faces gaunt from hunger. Yet, in their eyes, there was something the marked had lost: a light, a presence. She saw a man, once a respected doctor, now digging through trash for scraps of food. He had been stripped of everything, his name erased from every record, his credentials revoked. She saw a young woman, once a teacher, sitting outside a church that had long been shut down. She clutched a small Bible, her fingers trembling as she read by the dim light of the moon. She saw an elderly couple, once surrounded by their children and grandchildren, now alone. Their own family had turned them in, calling them dangerous for refusing the mark. The world had turned against them. Society had decided they no longer deserved to exist. At first, those who refused the mark tried to stay in the cities, believing they could survive quietly, unnoticed. But the system did not allow for neutrality. The unmarked were quickly identified. Without the mark, they could not buy food, rent homes, or even receive medical care. Banks shut down their accounts. Employers dismissed them. They became ghosts, forced out of society. Many fled. She saw small groups forming in the wilderness, hidden communities of believers. They gathered in forests, in mountains, in underground places where they would not be found. They had no electricity, no stores, no hospitals. But they had faith. Then, something extraordinary happened. She watched as a man knelt by the dry, cracked earth, his hands lifted in prayer. His family stood behind him, their faces weary with hunger. They had not eaten in days. Lord, you fed Elijah in the wilderness. You fed the Israelites with manna. You are the same God. As his voice trembled in the night air, something stirred in the ground. Before their eyes, plants began to sprout, vines thick with fruit, roots deep and strong. Food where there had been none. She saw another group, hiding in a cave, huddled around a child who was burning with fever. They had no medicine, no way to help. A woman laid her hands on the child's forehead, tears slipping from her eyes. Jesus, you healed the sick. You made the blind see. If we cannot turn to the world, we turn to you." At her words, the child gasped. His fever vanished in an instant. But not everyone stood firm. Some hesitated. She saw a man, once bold in his faith, now trembling as he held his starving daughter. "How can I let her suffer?" he whispered. "Surely God would understand if I took the mark just to feed her." Tears filled his eyes as he looked at his wife, hoping she would agree. But she only shook her head. "If we lose everything but keep our souls, we have lost nothing. If we gain the world but lose our souls, we have lost everything." The man turned away, wrestling with the decision. Some would hold on, some would give in, and Jesus' words echoed in her soul. They will be told they have no choice, but I will provide. Then Jesus showed her one last thing. She saw a woman standing in the ruins of a small town. She had once been wealthy, powerful, a leader among her people. Now she had nothing. She stood before a government official who offered her one final chance. "Take the mark, and you can have your life back: food, shelter, a home. You don't have to suffer anymore." She hesitated, her hands trembling. Then, with quiet strength, she looked him in the eyes and shook her head. "My life is not my own." And then she saw the price of her choice. She was taken away. But as they led her from the town, her face was radiant. And Veronica knew she had not been abandoned. She had been chosen. The vision faded, and Veronica found herself once more standing before Jesus. His eyes were filled with sorrow, but also with hope. The vision shifted again, and she was pulled into the final scene. She stood in the heart of a vast city, but it no longer resembled the world she once knew. Everything was clean, orderly, efficient. Digital screens displayed messages of unity, progress, and peace. The people moved in perfect synchronization, their faces blank, their eyes devoid of light. It was the new world, a world where everyone had accepted the mark. At first glance, it seemed peaceful. There was no crime, no conflict. But as she looked closer, she realized this peace had come at a terrible cost. These people were no longer themselves. She watched as a mother passed by a small child huddled in the corner of an alley. The boy looked up at her, his face streaked with dirt, his hands reaching out. "Mama," he whispered. But she did not stop. She did not even recognize him. She had taken the mark. Her love, her very soul, was gone. The scene changed. She was in a remote outpost, far from the cities, where the unmarked had gathered. They were the last ones left, those who had refused to submit. They lived in hiding, surviving on scraps, waiting for what they knew was coming. And then the day arrived. She saw the soldiers approaching, rows of them, marching in perfect formation. Their faces were unreadable. Their weapons gleamed in the dim light. Behind them stood a man in a suit, calm and composed. "We don't want to harm you," he said, his voice smooth, almost kind. "We want to help you. The world has moved forward. You don't have to suffer anymore." No one moved. Then came the final temptation. The man gestured toward a group of children, frail, hungry, their ribs visible beneath tattered clothing. "Think of your children," he said softly. "Is your pride worth their suffering? Give them a future. Let them eat. Let them live." Some of the parents wept, their hands shaking. Some stepped forward. A woman holding a starving baby sobbed as she whispered, "Forgive me," and she took the mark. Her husband reached for her, but the moment she accepted it, something in her changed. She turned away from him, her eyes suddenly cold. She no longer saw him. She no longer cared. But there were others, those who refused. They stood together, wary but unshaken, their hands clasped in silent prayer. One man, his face gaunt from hunger, stepped forward, not to surrender. "You cannot take what belongs to God," he said. "We have already made our choice." The man in the suit sighed. "So be it." The soldiers raised their weapons, and then the sky split open. A light, unlike anything Veronica had ever seen, poured down, brighter than the sun, brighter than life itself. The soldiers staggered, shielding their eyes. But the unmarked stood tall, their faces illuminated, their burdens lifted. Jesus had come. The vision shattered. A force stronger than anything Veronica had ever known pulled her backward, dragging her through layers of light and darkness. She felt as if she were falling, tumbling through eternity, rushing back towards something familiar, something heavy. Then, pain. A sharp gasp tore through her lungs as air rushed in. Her chest ached, her limbs felt weak, and her body, her frail, human body, was once again hers. She was back. She heard a voice, urgent, desperate. "Veronica." "Oh, thank God. Stay with me." It was Elena. Her hands gripped Veronica's, her face streaked with tears. The room spun around her, her vision blurred, her body shaking from the effort of simply existing again. She was alive, but she was not the same. She knew why she had returned. "The world is changing," she whispered. "The choice is coming. And it is not just a question of survival. It is a test of faith. I have seen what is coming. I have seen what happens to those who submit, but I have also seen those who stand firm. Jesus is coming soon. And when the time arrives, there will be no middle ground, only a choice. Will you stand firm, or will you surrender? The time to choose is now."